So when I saw your Mino video, I was like, I'm showing that to at least 3 students. And I sent it to them because it had never occurred to me that I needed to make a case for constraints. But after working with students, the thing that occurs to me is exactly as you said in your video, people see their favorite drummers. They look completely free. They look like they're just following their bliss. And then it's like, you want me to do building blocks exercises with double paradiddles. Why don't we just skip to the fun part? In your best words, what's the best case you can make for the need for constraints?
The case I would make is that you're using them, your favorite drummer, and if I think parallels to language aren't great actually, but this is a good one. When you speak, right, you're always imposing constraints, although it doesn't seem like you are. There's always a topic of conversation. There's 98% of the things you could say, or the words you could use, I should say, that you're not going to use because there's a topic of conversation. In drumming, when you see your favorite drummer play, there's a tempo, there's a time signature, there's a certain musical aesthetic that they're focusing on, and that excludes almost everything. So if I had to make a case for constraints, it would be that you can't really avoid them. Therefore, they are, in my experience, your primary tool, like manipulating the constraints is your primary tool for learning to improvise at all on the drums. I think that's the case.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think also the thing you say about the freedom being emergent from knowing the smaller elements is really huge too. Like you and Steve Lyman have both talked about that. Actually, both of you guys when you were on the podcast, and that was like a great way to put it into words for me too. And I agree with you, the language analogy isn't perfect, but the thing I like to use sometimes to illustrate this is the difference between speaking gibberish and speaking with sentences and words that make sense. So it's like you could theoretically just sort of unleash your creativity on the drums. And actually there are drummers that do that and it's killing. Right, like that Japanese guy on Instagram that's just, you know what I'm talking about, right?
I'm actually thinking Christian Lillinger.
Okay. But that's really niche. And in most circumstances, it would be sort of like, why don't I just talk? But then you don't know any words. You're just blurting out gibberish.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, constraints. So everything, all my ideas, I should say all the teaching methods that I come up with start from, the seed is usually trying to pay attention to what I'm experiencing when I'm playing.
Mm-hmm.
And I can't assume that it's the same as everyone else that's at whatever level I'm at, but I think it's probably similar. So constraints-wise, it's easy to, I feel like it's a little bit too easy to think of them wrongly as like an exercise imposed on you. But when if you broaden like the conception of constraints, when I'm playing the drums and I'm improvising and I'm feeling quite free, I'm having ideas about the types of patterns I want to use, the type of effect I want a moment to have. And those things, if you view them in this light, are constraints, right? So I'm gonna stick to the toms for a sec. Ooh, nice. That's a constraint. And like to sort of reverse engineer that back into the practice room, you'd be like, I don't have any, when I try to improvise on the toms and I can't use the snare drum, there's nothing there, right? So I think it's important to just broaden your conception of constraints, and you can almost just think of it as like, musical ideas, and the constraints are going to be built into that.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about the building blocks, because it's really parallel to something I teach called the switching exercise.
Let me give an example before we go there.
Oh, sure, of course. Oh, constraints, you mean?
Yeah, just why not? If I'm
since you're here.
Yeah, since we're at the kit, interviews at the drums are the best. So, constraints. I'm gonna play, sort of just start, and then we'll pause. Think about like what is the constraint here, and how is it creatively useful? So like 3 again, 4 again. So for me, there's several things that I didn't even think about, but aesthetically they're happening, and those are constraints. I'm sticking to the toms, I'm keeping time, and I'm in the 16th notes. That's already cut out like, 95% of what could be played. And then the patterns that I'm playing, I'm trying to remain in a certain vibe. So they're all based around like paradiddle, paradiddle, diddle, right, left, kick based material that I've practiced and I've sort of like automated to a certain degree, so that if I go 3 and a 4 and I remove all of the orchestration, it ends up being and that now, if we've sort of like taken off the bells and whistles, it's a lot easier to see how you could build exercises that help you do that part, which is this melodic thinking and improvisation based on a limited number of patterns that once you open up on the kit becomes what seems like a wide variety of things. If I choose to switch into a groove, this is a change of constraints. Like it's a musical change, but it's a change of constraints. Now I'm over here and I'm needing to rely on different vocabulary, different independence and coordination that presumably I had to automate as well and do exercises to get there. So I keep wanting to make constraints a friendly word. Like that's your friend, this is your ally, as opposed to constraints as something that is limiting in a way.
Yeah. I also think that there are theoretically infinite possibilities of stuff we could do on the instrument, but if you see someone sit down at a drum kit in a music store, even if they don't have any constraints, if they've never played the drums before, the range of ideas they're going to come up with is not very high. And I remember you talking about this in a drum channel thing I saw, where you were talking about asking a student to just improvise an interesting kick pattern over a basic funk groove. And he couldn't come up with anything besides like boom, chick, boom, boom, chick. And then you were like, okay, well, play back to me what I'm going to play. And then you played something interesting with like a nested 5-note group and like some across the bar line phrasing. And he was able to play that back to you. So from that, you came up with this idea that there's a difference between your listening vocabulary and your speaking vocabulary. Can you talk a little more about that and how you feel that plays into the constraints idea?
Yeah, the difference between your listening and speaking vocabulary is important to recognize only because it's easy to be fooled. And the test is really just like when there's nothing else going on, do you think of those rhythms, those rhythmic melodies, as I like to call them. But this is where this is the part of learning improvisation, of practicing the drums, that is the most mysterious, I think. So you have drills. We know how those work. They build the raw ingredients, but they don't become creative. Like you can play 10,000 paradiddles and still do nothing except play paradiddles with them.
Yeah.
And then there's this zone of like creative freedom, which you see your favorite drummers do, and it's just this, what looks effortless, although it is still constrained in the ways we've been talking about. It's this middle zone that is mysterious and hard to know what to do with as a teacher and a student. But I think this is the zone where you're building your listening vocabulary in a major way, because the drills give you the melody. It's built in. If we're doing like 4s and 2s, 4, 2, 4, 4, 2, 4, 4, 2, 4. It's on the page. I can read it. Okay. Now I want to get over here where I can think of that melody by accident without thinking of, oh, I played that on a PDF, it's number 7. So how do you do that? You have to practice the rearranging part. Like you have to have, this is where the constraints come in. You have to have what I call creative exercises. So if we want to be able to rearrange 4s and 2s, we start with drills because we can't start rearranging them. It's too much. And then, okay, I can do all the written combinations. And this is it's also calling back to your point about like, are you really inventing drumming in real time, or are you using pieces that are already programmed? If I've done all the possible combinations of 4s and 2s over 2 bars, and I've drilled them, and I'm listening to myself do them so the melodies are seeping into, what starts to happen is I start to be able to do the creative exercises. I turn the PDF over and I can go I'm in a 4/2 now from scratch on the fly, and I'm working on this internal skill, which is rearranging 4s and 2s on the flies and not getting confused by the melody. And I think that's one of the parts that people don't recognize as a challenge. Rearranging the patterns is easy. The melodies get confusing and they throw you off. You go over the bar line, you're sitting on upbeats for a bunch in a row, 4, 2, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4. If you're keeping left foot time, that helps. But you can get lost from the melody. So your listening vocabulary as you do the drills is being expanded by experiencing melodies you wouldn't have thought of on your own, because the drills are providing you new melodies you wouldn't have come up with. In the creative exercise zone in the middle, you're practicing coming up with those melodies from scratch, and you're ideally listening for what you always do and never do. And that's just giving you this feedback. You might not know what to do with it immediately, but if you always hit one, then you go back to the exercise and like, what are all the ones that go over the bar line? Let me drill those so that the melodies seep in, because the patterns aren't the problem anymore. So you're expanding, like so much time is spent expanding your listening vocabulary. I should say your speaking vocabulary, sorry, to get to your listening vocabulary, so that when you finally start to get over here a little bit, just with these patterns, you can turn it on and let it go effortlessly. And you might not have every possible melody ready to come out, but you might have a lot of them. And I don't think it takes that many to get past this tipping point where it seems like infinite melodies to the audience.
Yeah.
Surely there are some melodies I never ever think to play. They're just not in my speaking vocabulary.
Right.
But I don't think anyone's missing them past a certain amount of variability, if you will, variety.
That makes sense. I actually want to take a detour and run something by you. Are you cool if we switch for 15 seconds? What that just reminded me of is something that I started doing with my students that I want to see if you have any equivalent of, because I think I want to talk about the building blocks / switching exercise in a second. But these are yours. Nice, by the way. So Erskine's. But there's something that I've started doing with my students that I very non-creatively call an algorithm, which is like, okay, so I have one for jazz, but like one that we've been doing for funk is just like, okay, home bass is 8s and snare on backbeats, right? So snare's always on backbeats, and you can always retreat to 8s. No kick drum, so. Okay, so next to that, you can add a 3-note pattern with the right hand, or 5 notes out of 6. So, and you can place those anywhere you want in the bar. Sometimes I say begin the 3 notes on the quarter because it makes it more interesting phrases. Okay, next constraint. Every time you play a 3-note group, you need to play a kick drum on the 3rd note of that. So every time you play a 6-note group, you need to play a kick drum on the 4th note. So then I say, like, only constraint is keep the snare on 2 and 4. You know, take a couple practice sessions, like memorize this algorithm, and then like I feel like it'll point you toward more interesting counterintuitive musical ideas. And some love it and some really hate it. So we can switch back. My question is, does this jibe? Is there some equivalent, or does it? Yeah, does it link up with one of your teaching concepts, and also just more generally, like, how does that land?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of overlap. I spent in recent years, a lot of my course material has been on like flow on the kit, and then like flow grooves, these kind of that kind of thing. But this feels like a very adjacent idea in funk groove land. And I feel like the boxes I feel like you're checking that make this really work is that there aren't too many options. Like you've got 3 options, right? You're keeping time, you're 3ing, or you're 6ing. Right. And then you add a variation there. And I feel like the whole the whole point of the creative exercises is to get you doing things you wouldn't have thought to do or wouldn't have done habitually that are cool. Because there's a lot of dumb stuff you can do, but these sound cool. And that's why you need a good teacher who's playing you like, because they're going to come up with stuff from their own vocabulary. Yeah, and if I'm in like the build courses model instead of coaching one-on-one.
Right.
Then all I would do, the step I would have to add with this would be for the sixes, like the drills, just to link this into the existing sort of 3-step thing we've got going on, is drilling the ability to do the, right? So like doing measure 1, measure 2, measure 3, getting comfortable with it so you can in the first place. And then doing what I call the drop and go approach, which is like play eighth notes, and then put it here, put it here, put it here, move through the grid. Everyone will think of that.
I call that the safe haven.
Nice.
It's like you can always retreat back to eighth notes.
Yeah.
If things get dicey, just go back to eighth notes. Yeah.
So yeah, I'm with you 100%. And I can imagine for students that adding the kick drum is like a step that like puts it into like, oh, this is really sick kind of territory. Because that's really where you get these sort of like moments. And I feel like it's important to not think of improvising and drumming as this thing that needs to be new all the time, even like pattern-wise, and also like the music you're making. Like you want habits. You just want your habits to be sick. And you want to have go-to stuff that you do sort of mindlessly, and everyone has that, and that's sort of like, your sound accidentally to some degree. But yeah, that's really sick.
With that out of the way, the building blocks exercise that I call the switching exercise. Yeah, I'm curious if you're willing to introduce that concept a little bit and talk a little bit about how it came about, like what problem it was solving.
Yeah, it came about, there's this course I have called the 16 Invisible Rhythms course. And I thought it was really clever at the time. It helps you play grooves like this, which are like really, this is like a hallmark of modern drumming, I feel like. And I call this a flow groove, really creative, because you're flowing and you're grooving at the same time. You're grooving in that you maintain a backbeat and you're in groove position. You're flowing, you're improvising in the sense that your hands are improvising. And so the idea was, how do you teach someone to do the improvisation part? And again, I'm always thinking about rhythmic vocabulary, which I'm always thinking about rhythmic melodies. The skill that needs to be developed, almost the only skill that needs to be developed, is the ability to play unfolding melodies on the hi-hat that are unique and interesting and that you're making up on the fly. So this is the hard part, actually. Because if that's happening, the technical putting the backbeat in is a relatively small step. And once that's all happening, you can cook, you can then everything's smooth. But if the melody's not happening, nothing else can happen. So my friend Ian Barnett, awesome drummer, was super into, well, for a long time, has been into this genre called footwork. And footwork has the, that melodic chunk, boom, 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 which is 1/16th note different from the most common melody, doom, 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 doom. The last note is one earlier, doom, 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 doom. So I was around Ian a lot. He was listening to this stuff. He was including that rhythm in his playing a lot. And it's just a permutation, right? So this was all sort of, I don't know, some kind of light bulb moment that happened over a little bit of time. It's a permutation of the first pattern. You have da, 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 and then you have ba, da, ba, 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 ba. And then there's a couple other ones he would use all the time, like 3 and 4 and stuff like that. And I was like, these are all permutations of this pattern. So anyways, all I did was take the 8 permutations of that pattern, and then I was thinking, if you can basically mix these up on the fly, it'll always work, and it'll always sound good, and it gives you a starting place. And then I just added 8 more, which are based on da 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 da. If you permutate that 1/16 over, you get 3 and 4 and you can permutate that through the grid, and you have 8 more. That's why I call them 16 invisible rhythms. I call them the invisible rhythms because they're kind of everywhere. So when you see someone doing this type of stuff, they're probably not thinking of this specific method because they're already at the point where they can sort of have the rhythmic stream of consciousness running. But a way to develop that skill and then sort of forget it is this building blocks approach. That's where it came from. And the thing I think is interesting about the approach is how much it is a means to an end. Because you've got 16 chunks of melody, and basically the idea is rearrange them on the fly. However, you can't think of all 16 at once. You really just can't hold them all in your mind. So you work on these in pairs, right? You can imagine the exercises. Like, it's take any 2, match them up. They'll almost always sound cool. Number 2 plus number 10 is and then you work on getting the kick drum involved, adding extra accents here and stuff. But that's how you do the work. And just like what we described with the previous exercise with the 4s and 2s and stuff, it's that middle gray zone that is challenging. The drills are easy, pairs. The end is easy because it's by definition easy. The creative exercise part of all this is where you try to do this on the fly. And it's this weird internal like balance that needs to happen where you will think of individual melodies. But you also need to stop thinking of the melodies or the individual chunks and think melodically. Right? You need to go ba 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 da ba da ba ba da ba ba da ba 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 da ba ba da ba ba. That was definitely made up of the chunks, but I can't tell you which ones, and I wasn't thinking of that when.
Right.
So you do the drills to get you to this point where you can do some improvisation with it. And then you start repeating yourself, and then you try to identify, what am I repeating? What am I never playing? And you go back to them, and you do this back and forth. And as you do this, when you get into the creative practice stuff, it pushes further and further. So you start to actually, again, get past that point where you're thinking of not every possible melody ever. I don't think anyone's doing that. I don't think that's the goal. You're thinking of enough variation in the melody that it feels to both you and the audience like you are improvising a new thought. And I think that's okay, that's fair. That is the goal. The goal isn't constant new drumming. The goal is enough new vocabulary so that every time you speak a thought, it feels like a new thought. You use the same words to answer this or that question, but it feels like a new thought. Even if you tell the same story, even if you teach the same idea, it feels different every time because you are improvising it again based on the internal idea. So that, long story short, is where what I now call the building blocks approach came from for me. And I haven't done that much experimenting with like bringing that into a fill context or some smaller context where I very explicitly use that. But that's where it was born, and there's a couple other flow groove type of settings where it works really well. But do you have other case studies for that?
Yeah, actually. The thing you were just demonstrating, I feel like this is ubiquitous in modern drumming, and everybody's kind of seen it, and I agree, there's kind of a mystery over the origin of it. It's a similar thing to like ride cymbal bell melodies too, right? It's like, what are you supposed to play on the ride cymbal bell? Like, right? And the way I think about it is sort of just like claves, right? So like the phrase I use for it is funk claves, but it kind of went in the opposite direction for me, where I was seeing, I guess it's sort of like the Thomas Pridgen, David Garibaldi style of improv, where it's just like really big contrast between accents and ghost notes, a lot of ghost notes on the snare drum, and then punctuations on the toms or rim shots. So, like that sort of thing. So my approach was actually to start with claves like are written out in John Riley's book, like the art of bop drumming. So like for the swing beats, he'll have you play like a swing beat on the ride cymbal and then melodies with the left hand. So like, well, that's a clave. So, long story short, back when my friend Kyle and I were at MSM with John, Kyle invented a way to take John's claves and then put a kick drum before the resolution point. And then years later, I came back to that. I'm like, well, this is kind of a way to approximate that style of drumming. But then, like, how do I get people to improvise with it? So I was like, okay, well, sort of as you did, like, what are some component parts? Like, and actually, it's very similar to what you did with the Meinl video, with the sextuplet thing. But it's just like, well, I feel like I hear a lot of drummers just playing this shape. I feel like I hear a lot of drummers playing this shape. I feel like I see a lot of drummers playing this shape. Okay, well, what if I tell a student alternate between like A and C, right? So you can change orchestration, you can change order, but the integrity of the shapes needs to be maintained. So like, and just as you described, you start to assemble a lexicon, and then you sort of see like where somebody's repeating themselves, or where they kind of seem like a one-trick pony a little bit, and then you sort of just like supplement. And like one big thing is like, I feel like a cheat code is the left, right, or right, left kick with the accent on the left. So, because that feels like it opens up a bunch of ambidexterity, and you can interchange it with the right, left. So. Like that instantaneously opens up a bunch of stuff. Finally, I went the other way. I'm like, okay, someone was asking me about like, this sort of thing. So I'm like, well, maybe this is similar to if you practice these sort of switching exercises, these claves around the toms, but then you just fix the backbeat and like move the lead hand to the hats. So similar thing from a different direction. Yeah, curious how that lands in, if you have any thoughts about that.
Yeah, that all checks out for me big time. I think I feel like you just made this clearer to me than I've ever thought of it. I feel like there's like these two big phases. Maybe there are other ones surrounding them, but like one of them is where the building blocks stuff works, mostly even numbers. This, I think, has a different goal with developing the improvisational kit than the second phase, which is one where the odd number, like you get comfortable with odd numbers. And really, I pretty much mean threes. like second nature level comfort with groups of three. And then, like tag onto that groups of six, tag onto that some stutters of those, and hey, look, now you're playing some groups of five here and there. And then you are using the twos, fours, and sixes, the twos and fours, I should say, that you've already worked on. And I feel like there are two different goals, and I feel like they're fundamental to developing freedom on the kit, but distinct. One of them is just the skill of rearranging patterns on the fly, no matter what the difference is. So in like the demonstration you just did, it's not duration of pattern, it's orchestration and dynamics within the pattern. Mm-hmm. An awesome way to get a ton of juice out of a group of four. And then, right, so that's one skill that needs to be actually actively developed that I think is easy to miss, is rearranging things on the fly and knowing what they are, not doing it haphazardly. And then the second skill I'm thinking about is you really don't have a choice, I feel like, once you're dealing with odd groupings. And I just mean threes for the most part. Mm-hmm. You have to get to this next phase of like, you're following the melody as opposed to following the grouping. Like maybe you hijack the grouping exercise-wise, drill-wise, to get you to the melody in the beginning, right. But you just cannot get stuck thinking of the patterns forever,
right,
when you start dealing with odd numbers. Mm-hmm. So that means that's where your rhythmic vocabulary, your melodic thinking needs to like blossom in a way. And I don't know what your experience with this is, but I think patterns like right, left, kick are super, I think most drummers underestimate how hard that is to do. And groups of three, to just like get them going, maybe start and stop them, but not on one the same place every time, that is so much harder than most people think. I feel like, you think like, okay, right, left, kick, short pattern, can't be that hard. Groups of three, come on, can't be that hard. It really is, I feel like. But I think it's not because like anything technical, it's because of this change that I think maybe that we're describing, where you like really have to have a transformation, an evolution, if we want to think in Pokemon terms, from thinking about the patterns to thinking about the melody. But that's one of the most, I feel like one of the most important things you can get to. Like I think spending a year focused on groups of three, like a whole year where you're just like obsessing over threes and stuttering them, and that means there are some fives, and you're going over the bar line and making this second nature just as a melody in your head and on the kick drum, probably one of the best things like most drummers could do on their improv journey.
You know what's funny is the very first switching exercise I gave to a student was right, left kick, and right, left kick, all in 16ths. And it was
super hard.
Yeah, it was an in-person lesson I was teaching in Spain, and I was just like, yeah, let me see how this falls. And absolutely, like the hard part about it for him was the cycling over the bar line and the shape kind of turning and permutating, and not being like having to keep that and also one in his head at the same time. So since then, like we start with symmetrical stuff and then only later move into the threes and fives over the bar line. But you brought up something interesting, which is this idea that in your mind, without those wild cards that rearrange the permutation, that actually we're not really making melody. And when you think about it, that's true. Like a melody isn't ba da 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 unless you're playing like a march, right? You want like ba 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 da ba, right? Like that's syncopation. That's what's cool. That's what makes you want to dance. So you sort of supplied a missing piece in terms of the ethos, because that's another thing students ask me is like, well, why do we have to do this across the bar line stuff? And I'm always just like, like if you listen to your favorite players, like generally the phrases are more interesting. It's like, no, without that, melody doesn't exist. I like that a lot.
Yeah, what I've been saying a lot lately with the over the bar line stuff is like, because in almost every one of my courses, you have to deal with over the bar line. And it really depends where you are on your rhythmic vocabulary journey, because like it'll always be impassable no matter what the underlying material is, until you get to a certain point, in which case it's always okay. But what I always say is like, if you're hitting one every bar and playing a huge amount of variety between, playing one every bar steals all the variety. It sounds the same. Like if I go boom, ba do, do ga, ba, boom, ga, 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 da da, boom, ba da, ba da, ba da, boom, ga, ga, boom. It doesn't matter how cool it is. If I just don't play one, boom, ga, da, ga, da, ga-da, 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 da, da, da. It's like the same melodies, same amount of variation, but now it feels like the thought continues. And I feel like that is everyone's first step in the door thinking about phrasing. If you are playing kicks on one every time, and then you just like take one of those out, if you're automated enough to hear the sound of your drumming as you do that, you'll experience a phrasing. You'll feel a change in phrasing maybe for the first time. You'll like get that concept because it's really hard to like define what that is. Mm-hmm. But I feel like it's a musical thought, a complete musical thought, and you know when it starts and you know when it ends in the same way that a sentence does, but they're not all the same length. So yeah, I'm with you 100%.
I feel like there's one other interesting, well, at least one other interesting element to cover in this thread, which is where the heck do we think that, like that sort of modern rim shot, soft ghost note, like big tom accent, Garibaldi, Thomas Pridgen thing came from? Like, have you given any thought to like where that originated, or like, because if you go back far enough, drummers aren't playing like that, and then all of a sudden they are. And I feel like I also get that with students where they're like, why do I have to learn to play like this? And again, the case I make for them is like, okay, well, you just told me you like Brian Blade, Thomas Pridgen, like Garibaldi, Vinny. Like, if you look closely, all of those guys are doing that.
Yeah.
But yeah, do you have any thoughts about that?
I'm super bad with drum history, but I'm tempted to throw like this, like the Steve Gadd, Vinny, not so much Dave Weckl, Steve and Vinny era in there. I don't know. I hear it like when I think of Steve Gadd, I think of that, but it's not the same sort of like energy that it has morphed into, but the dynamics of it and like the basic functionality of it, I can hear. I feel like I hear that. I can like sort of hear echoes of some Vinny videos I've watched where I'm like, kind of a precursor in there. I don't know. Anything before that come to mind?
No, I guess not. I kind of think of Garibaldi as the modern godfather of it, maybe just because Pridgen studied with him, and in that video, Tower of Groove, like he codifies it so explicitly. I think it's true that probably Vinny and Weckl, and like if you listen to Dennis Chambers in the 80s with Schofield's band, like he was clearly doing that before Garibaldi. Heck, if you listen to Garibaldi in the 70s with Tower of Power, he was doing that then. Harvey Mason was to a degree, although it wasn't as quantized. But yeah, maybe that's a much deeper discussion, but like maybe that's a video. Like, why do all modern drummers sound that way, right?
There you go. I'll watch it. I don't know.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. So another really interesting thing for me is I feel like in my teaching, there's a lot of buzz killing when it comes to exactly this sort of modern style we talk about. And Garibaldi's one, Thomas Pridgen is one. There's a drummer on Instagram named Marcus Thomas. I don't know if you've checked him out, but another exemplar of just that very sort of clean style of playing that obviously evolved into a lot of gospel music. But my students are very often like, why do we have to learn it this way? And I think I spend a fair amount of time on things like making sure the ghost notes are less than an inch above the drum, making sure they're getting clean, consistent rim shots, making sure the distance between any 2/16 is consistent. Maybe in a bit we can do some demos, but I'm curious how that lands for you, if you feel like that's an emphasis for you as well. What's your experience been interfacing with students in that regard?
And you mean especially, or particularly working out the technique stuff along the way? Like you're talking about gridding and dynamic consistency, and like that's the one part, but then there's the why are we learning it this way? So,
well, I suppose maybe we leave the why are we learning it this way to the side, because that's a deep historical question. But I guess to distill this into a question, when you have stuff from your students or people taking your courses coming back at you, are you seeing the areas where maybe there's a gap between what's in the video, what you intend, and what they actually play? And how do I phrase this so it doesn't sound like either of us is throwing our students under the bus?
Yeah, no, I hear you. I mean, I feel like, the question is essentially, how do you balance, like, am I right in thinking? The question is, how do you balance refining the music of the playing to sound good, sound like the pros, versus like building the vocabulary and the ability to do the stuff in the first place?
Correct. So there's the what and the how, right?
Nice, yeah.
So if and maybe this is in my head because I'll see videos of people playing my stuff, and very often they're getting the what. So it's like if it's kick, snare, tom, they'll do that correctly, but the sounds will be kind of muddled. Like if I intend like a clean, clear rim shot, instead it'll be either a head stroke or kind of a halfway rim shot. Maybe they're not hitting the center of the drums, and there ended up being all these pesky details to resolve with the how.
Yeah, I focus a lot on the what. Partially because of the nature of what I do. Right, I'm mostly not with students in the room, so the what, when the what is in place, to me the what is the hardest part to develop technically for most people, and the how to make it sound good is like a mix of like your musical intuition developing and hearing yourself play and getting that feedback. And then yes, like definitely sometimes you have to like get into some drills and like run whatever it is, snare drum work that automates your dynamics or something like that. But in my case, I'm working pretty exclusively with the what on my website in these courses. And then at each chapter, people can submit what's called a progress post, which is like a video that you respond with another teaching video. And that's where me and the two instructors on the site try to catch this kind of thing, where you're finding technique stuff, hitting the drum in the center, tone stuff, dynamic balance stuff. And those things are really big. And I think there's like in the beginning, like the technical challenge is so big that there's nothing more to think about. And then the easier it gets to play the stuff. And I think this is the if there's a lesson here, it's this, that like you want a gradient where your focus, the focus of your ears sort of like expands, sits back, and turns on, becomes receptive as you automate the stuff. Where it's starting to flow now, my 4s and 2s, or whatever it might be, my groups of 3, these patterns. Now that it's starting to not take up 100% of my CPU, it's taking up 60%, I'm going to use the 40 remaining to listen to what's going on. Does it sound good? Does it feel good? Let me look at like how are the dynamics and adjust from there. Because I think that's I'm tempted to say it's the easier part to do, but it's kind of not, in the sense that it's a life journey that depends on your intuition, which is built over like a lot of time listening to music and listening to yourself play. But I feel like the listening to yourself play as you play and in recordings, watching back, is probably the most important part, like imitating what you hear it's supposed to sound like.
Yeah. It feels like you actually outsource that taste to the students more. And that's an interesting thing for me to consider, because I feel like I've been pretty regimented. Like before we're learning very much what, we're focusing on a lot of how. And the how is this pretty regimented system with rim shots 10 to 12 inches above the drum, tom accents the same way, as I said, ghost strokes within an inch, learning to play in the center of the snare so that all the strokes have a similar sound. And what I'm considering is that I guess maybe the center of gravity for the dilemma would be if I left it to students more to say, hey, when you have spare bandwidth, does this sound good to you? Just use your instincts, gravitate toward what sounds good to you. Almost in the same way as if there are zero constraints, like would people actually know what to play? I wonder if it would even occur to them that there's a difference between an off-center rim shot and a rim shot in the center. And yeah, so like when you and your instructors are getting the progress checks or whatever from your students, like, again, without throwing any students under the bus, maybe we can put a positive framing on this. Like, what are the biggest areas for potential improvement where there are sort of lead dominoes in terms of the how, where you can give them one bit of advice and that sort of 2x's the sound that they're getting from the same exercise?
Yeah, it's definitely dynamic depth and consistency, which is, that's the David Garibaldi, potential origin story that we were talking about of like, there's clean on, is the time clean? And then is the dynamic consistency clean? And I feel like the dynamic consistency is harder to get clean, and we're always thinking about playing on the grid. I don't know if we're less likely to be paying close attention to the dynamic depth in that way. But the only other thought I have on this is it depends a lot, obviously, on what the student's trying to do. Students who are, they are going to audition for music school, or they really want to do this. They want to play drums for a living. They should get a different treatment with these technical things, because not only do they need it, and it's, you're doing a great service, but they're also going to do their work. Because I always hated that work. I mean, part of the reason I don't do that stuff is like, I hate that stuff and I don't do it. I never did it. So yeah, I feel like in my student, like my focus with the courses is like developing improvisational freedom. And that does translate into sounding like a professional drummer. But I also know that a lot of my students, I'm very hesitant to give any kind of percentage or anything, aren't trying to be professional drummers, but they're serious. Like my student base is pretty serious about their development. I'm most interested in helping people experience that sort of like wonderful, again, threshold past of I can open the faucet, things can come out, and I actually like how they sound, and it feels good to do it. Because I think that is the sustainable goal that matters the most. To me, that's just like, that's the point of it all. If I stop gigging and making videos, I'll still go play my drums, and because it feels good and I like it and it's deep. So I'm trying to get people there. That's sort of like the relatively narrow focus. And then, if you want to be a professional drummer, you just have to open the focus that much. It's all the same stuff, but you have to, like you're saying, you have to pay closer attention to that kind of stuff. I tend to, well, in this regard, I teach how I learned, in the sense that like drills, I didn't want to do drills.
So that opens up another area, which I felt like you were hinting at in the Meinl video, when you said everything that we practice down to the smallest component should kind of be fractal, to use a slightly nerdy word, with improvising in real life. So, and what that said to me was that this sort of concept of, if we're going to spend time getting reps, the simulation should be a pretty good simulation of reality. Like even if we're taking like just a couple pixels of reality, they should be like the same pixels as you see in reality, and weaving that together with the thread of your feelings about drills, I wonder if you, to some degree, share my conviction that if a student is saying they want to improvise and spending a large percentage of their practice time on drills that aren't super well related to what they actually want to do in real life, that maybe I'm trying to put this politely, there should be some time redistribution.
Yeah, yeah. I wonder though, maybe the only difference but in the ways that we're thinking about it is what we're considering like reality, like what are we imitating? I'm not necessarily thinking of like a gig or professional situation.
Sure.
I'm just thinking of past that threshold of fluent improvisation, which to me is the goal of all the hours of practice. What do you need there? And that's a pretty wide net, I'd say. But you can definitely spin your wheels and waste years of your time not doing that. Of course, that has to be your goal. If that's not your goal, it's another story. But if that's the goal, then that's what there needs to be continuity with the exercises and the drills. And I would say the drills. That's where the continuity gets severed the most frequently. I would say even like the tendency that we all have to like when practice pad in front of you play paradiddles, that's mostly a waste of time. Like just if you've played 90% paradiddles when you're on a practice pad, you can stop and come up with something different. Like practice, actually this is actually a perfect example of what we're talking about. Like practice pad, like one of the things I'm always, if the course makes sense to say this in, that I'm always saying in the course is like as soon as we get to this point where there's like this much improvisation, but it's still on the snare drum or it's still very constrained, I say like, dude, this is your warm-up or this is your practice pad stuff. Like jump straight to the stuff that matters. So that if you're practicing paradiddles, you're also practicing making melodies with paradiddles, because that matters. But just playing paradiddles as quarter notes doesn't matter because you can already do it. That's why I've never focused on speed. That's why I don't think I've ever advised a student to like really work on their speed unless they were like, I want to be faster. In which case, they usually kind of lose that after we get into like stuff that's actually rewarding. It's like you can do speed drills for the next 6 months and be this much faster. It's not going to make you any more creative. It's not going to make it any more fun. In fact, your perception of speed is going to change. You're not going to feel like you're any faster when you get there. So yeah, that's where my head's at with this stuff.
I think I'm in the same place when it comes to what we consider reality. So I mean, yeah, you're talking to a guy who's mostly played in the practice room for the past decade. Yeah, and yeah, I don't really feel bad about it either. I think like to a degree that's a selling point. It's like the drums should be inherently pleasurable to play, right? Like you want to sit down and feel free and enjoy yourself. And often students will ask me like, is competence always going to be this vanishing horizon that I'm always comparing myself to? Is it always going to? Am I always going to feel like I suck? And often I'll say yes to number one, no to number two. Like you'll always feel like you're reaching for a receding goal line, but there is a threshold that when you cross it, like most of the time, playing the kit feels good. I feel like we're a little bit on the opposite side of the spectrum in terms of speed. And maybe that's because I have like an outsider's love or an immigrant's love for it, because I always looked up to like the Berkeley guys or the Prague guys or the Chops, the gospel guys, in terms of like as a jazzer, whereas like everything is like low volume or whatever, and just like, oh, I just want to chop, bro. Yeah. So with a lot of my students, I almost feel like I'm trying to incept them with a desire to chop. So it's just like, you think you don't want to take solos, like, hey, let's just learn a little improvisation. Like, okay, doesn't that feel sick? Don't you feel powerful? Like, hey, what if we up the metronome? Like, say you're playing a funk groove at 80 and you just want to throw in some 30-second notes. And I'm like coaxing them over that.
I love it. Yeah. I think we do have the opposite nature in that case, especially just like the older I get, the slower and quieter I want to play. I never was a chopper, and I really like wanted to be one, and then I just like aged out of the desire, literally based on like I don't want to have to move that fast. Like I don't want to have to do this ever, because that is too much energy. So I'm just like on this path of like, how can I like do this over the drums? And stuff happen, and I don't even care. Yeah. So that's probably the crux of the difference.
No, that's interesting. Yeah, what are some things you're working on currently when you're able to practice that you're fired up about?
What have I been working on lately? I have been working on singles, which is funny.
Sweet, tell me more.
Yeah, I feel like last year I discovered doubles for the first time, I feel like, and paradiddles. And I'm not even joking. And this year I'm like, wow, to be able to improvise with singles would be sick. So, my journey was very much like Dave Weckl inspired in the formative days, and then like Vinny, and then I was at Berkeley and surrounded by like cats who could chop in all sorts of different ways. So, and like I said, I never did the drill phase. I never was into marching. I was never into any of that stuff. So I ended up at stuff like, it was just like. Like modern linear flow.
Right.
And then I took a lesson with Dan Weiss because I was trying to get my jazz chops together a couple of years ago now. And he was like, check out this lick, this like, literally in passing. This literally was a throwaway moment in the lesson that was not the focus of anything. He was pointing to a measure in Wilcoxon, and he was like, look, Philly Joe Jones. You can hear him just like saying only those words. And then he played it, and it was a... And I was like, okay, cool. And then we talked about other stuff. And then at home, I was like, oh, that was a cool lick. And then I was like, it's paradiddle stuff. And then it's like the system just like immediately formed. I was like, okay, this is paradiddles. It's the fours and twos. It's the fours and twos from earlier. Your fours are paradiddle. Anyways, this turned into like doubles being useful for me personally in my personal vocabulary. So like last year's focus was majorly double stuff, and it turns into this sort of paradiddle and double heavy stuff where into triplets. So last year was the year of doubles. This year, I haven't drilled down deeply enough, but like literally singles, mostly in triplets, have been like a big deal. Actually, before triplets is like, well, let's stick with singles first. Just being able to like play triplet singles and play accented melodies is crazy hard, right? And then trying to get my kick drum in there. You can see me already defaulting to like, I default to like patterns I'm more comfortable with. But just to be able to play melodies with singles. And it was really part of I've kind of been in a jazz hole the last couple of years. This is kind of an outgrowth of that, just learning finally that like it sounds different when you do it with singles. You know, whatever it is. Like if I'm going versus like it just feels different. And especially when you get into like the like that kind of stuff, it just, so much more power is possible with the singles. So that's one area of focus. And then finally getting into like flams. And I think of these three as like the same approach, but different variations. There's like flams, herdas, and triplets as accents. So it's kind of, this is a weird tempo for it, but that type of stuff. So those have just been part of the singles journey, where it's like I want to be able to just play like this is all, that was child's play for someone that did drumline or something. But this, this is just this huge hole in my foundation that's basically like literally singles and doubles that I never really built up. That's a primary focus for the moment. I don't think there's anything else. Oh, along with the jazz hole that I've been in, I've been trying to develop more vocabulary more vocabulary where I'm here, but I'm able to do more here.
Yeah.
As is just the infinite quest of jazz. But one version of that, or one thing I've been working on, is just getting more, like I'm always trying to play less kick drum, because at least my development was one where like I got to this point where it was just like, I can play a lot of stuff and it's just kicks everywhere. It's just like, so I'm trying to get more kickless vocabulary, you know what I mean? In triplets, just like. And then the doubles that I was talking about earlier, the like groove, or I would say modern jazz comping vocabulary version of those was an outgrowth from the stuff that I was doing on the kit. So like being over here, if I like lock myself in the doubles box, that type of stuff, and then obviously like mixing it into what's going on. Those have been the main focuses lately, yeah.
Yeah, so the common theme that emerges is what we began the conversation with, which is using constraint to inspire counterintuitive things, right? Speaking of Dan, like, I remember that was a big part of Dan's, like, middle period, I would say. Like, where I think now he's like checking out a lot of old school jazz drummers, which is awesome. But for a while he was into this, like, literally taking mathematical equations and then like playing them on the drums, because maybe the math will show me something that didn't occur to me.
He's a
monster. Yeah, that's all super interesting.
What about you? What are you working on?
Yeah, actually I have a question. I have a few questions. We got a few questions. I mean, so one thing that's always in my mind, it's like when I sit in person with someone who generally I've either seen at a distance or on the socials, I feel like almost everybody is like 40% louder than I am. So one focus has actually just been to slow things really down and just try to be loud but efficient at the same time, because I'm also no spring chicken. And that kind of plays into my left-hand thing that I'll ask you about. But actually that thing you said earlier about never wanting to have to do this, like that resonates too, especially as a guy who has, like, probably every joint of every limb has been tweaked in a way it shouldn't, like in the last few years. But just sort of taking basic shapes and kind of chasing a feeling improvisationally while trying to be loud but efficient. So like, just like that sort of thing, in the hopes that'll seep in to other stuff I'm doing, and then not really sweating it so much when I'm improvising other stuff. My other major side quest has been like, I don't know if we talked about this, but basically completely revamping my left hand, because for so many years it was just like a claw, where I kind of just had this like sort of lazy back fulcrum, and I was kind of forcing it, and I'd played a bunch of trad in college and afterwards when I was doing jazz, and I'd never really bothered making it good. And lately in my quest to chop, I noticed that it finally was becoming a limitation, both in terms of speed and volume, and even just like, speaking of singles, if I'm just exploring some singles around the kit. I was finding that I was death gripping it, and my hand was creeping up it, so I'm just like, fuck it, like stop the music. We're just gonna revamp this. So I just looked really carefully at what I was doing with my right. My right, I think because of like all the jazz ride cymbal stuff, it just sort of floats a little more effortlessly. There's a lot of like middle finger I'm doing. So like now if I'm playing most anything with the right, I'm not even really sweating a fulcrum. It's just sort of like, sometimes I can rotate it French, but otherwise it's just kind of floating here. And it's just like Murray Spivak linear with the forearm thing. So I'm just like, fuck, well, let's get that going with the left hand. So like one thing I do is I'll like practice just balancing the stick, just using the middle finger to keep it from falling off, and then doing that sort of whip motion just to get this feeling. And then I'll do a lot of exercises just around chasing that feeling of that like full range of motion, push pull. So just trying to feel this. So yeah, so much of what I've been working on warm-up wise is just chasing that feeling, and then sort of like, so I'll do like some permutated paradiddles, and maybe throw in some rim shots. Just because that's like an easy way for me to locate the feeling. It's like that snap is there with the doubles and also with the rim shot. And then once I have that in my head, like I'll try to challenge it. So it's like, okay, well, let me throw in some singles because singles are more challenging. Like, right, okay. And once that feels good, maybe I'm doing singles around the toms because that's imposing like lateral forces on it too, et cetera, et cetera. And then the other major thing has just been, well, yeah, actually, let's pause. Does that left hand stuff resonate with you? Is there anything that pops out to you there?
It all checks out with me, man. The only things like I would add to your list of things to think about is like, I don't see this as like an internal question, this one, so I don't know if it's a problem at all. But like I'm often thinking about like the movement before the stroke. And I feel like for the left, or it's easy for especially the weekend to like trigger at the moment.
Yes.
As opposed to like some kind of like, even if it's tiny and momentary, like preparation for it. I don't know if you feel that internally, but maybe it's worth feeling for, even when you're doing like, especially like the paradiddle typey stuff. Is there like a preparation moment that would make it easier? I don't know.
Yeah, I think that's deep, and I think the feeling of that is the feeling of not being surprised in that way.
Exactly. Yeah.
And I think like these sort of like the sort of those, some of those volume seeking things. I think I am trying to access the feeling of like an adequate time to wind up and slap.
Do you play rim shots again with your left? Like play some flow with the rim shots?
Okay.
The only other thing that like I just tried to stop doing this because I was having elbow pain, is like, you do kind of, everyone does this, but like you like rim shot and push through like a fraction of a second more.
Mm-hmm.
If I'm just thinking about left hand efficiency, like trying to like let that rim shot actually like bounce
Yeah.
and then back into it, you know. Cool. Yeah.
That's good. That's good.
That's
Yeah.
the only thing I'm often thinking of that with my own playing, just to try and make it literally feel better internally to play. But I catch that with students a lot too.
Interesting. Yeah, that's great advice. Yeah, and then on the other side, like I'll be brief on this because my people who are seeing this video will have heard it already. But the similar thing, like if you're finding constraints with sort of the type of stroke, like singles, doubles, paradiddles, I'm imposing constraints with rhythmic context. So like one thing I've been thinking about over the year, you actually mentioned this, was like doubled triplets. So it's like if you had to take a solo over a Purdy shuffle, right? So whatever it is, right? Like that sort of thing. But then from there, I was doing a shed with a guy, and we were doing that, and then he had like another gear, which was triplets over triplets.
Nice.
And then I was like, fuck, now I need
So
to
you
learn
call those
triplets.
doubled triplets? Is that what
Yes.
you called them?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. I've never known the word to distinguish them.
I don't know either. And I've had people correct me and like, those are sextuplets. And I'm like, you're wrong.
Well,
It's a different common denominator.
right. Well, I think like they are sextuplets, but they're broken in 3 groups of 2 instead of 2 groups of 3.
Exactly. Yeah.
But
Yeah.
double triplets is a nice way to clarify that, because I don't have a term for it. It's nice. And then you just say 16 double triplets or sextuplets for.
Exactly.
Cool.
Yeah, and so
Triplets.
triplets. So then that's like if you think about a really slow Purdy shuffle. like that sort of thing. And actually an easier way to think about it is like a jazz waltz, right? So. Like that sort of thing. So that's.
It's funny, I would think of it as 6/8 in triplets. Same thing, it's all the same thing. I don't know if you had this realization at some point, but I had the like doubled triplets moment where I was like, oh, this exists. And this was like 20 years into drumming. I'd never encountered the difference between and with the second one, like you were saying, I just had like literally no vocabulary. For me, it was a 6/8 groove. I heard Aaron Spears, rest in peace, playing. It was like a, and then he was going into all sorts of cool stuff. And I was like, I'm gonna do that. And I was like, I've never done this somehow at 20 whatever years old. Anyways, one of my favorite things to do, and one of the easiest things to do, to leave you with a short drum lesson, jumping between that downbeat and the third partial of the paradiddle, using paradiddle-diddles. The downbeat is obviously the easy part. The upbeat, 3 and the 4 and the. So, down, down, up, up. Right, so if you can play the downbeats, play the upbeats, move between them, you need 4 notes, singles work, to get up. 2 notes get you back down. And you can just move between down and up as a way of improvising.
Sick.
You can even probably oh, stop there. You can imagine the possibilities, but that's a fun one. The
Then you're
simple
in
one,
Jarvis territory.
it's a simple one, but yeah, as soon as I don't have one of these, so I don't know how to use it. But it's fun because paradiddle-diddles are relatively easy to crank up to a high speed, and then you can actually play some melodies with them.
Sick. Well, thank you.
Of course. Thanks for having me, man.
Pleasure.